this week and the last week of the practical course real-time computer graphic exercises. In this week, we'll be talking mainly about explosions. You killed your enemies, and now we want something to happen because it doesn't look cool enough. Uh, Mainly, we're gonna be basically just make an animated sprite, which is just a sprite that changes its texture at a certain rate, and then spawn the explosion, and also particles that come out of the explosion to make it more effective. Uh, yeah. So a way to animate a sprite is how you animate anything else. Is that you have keyframes and then you transition through these keyframes at a certain interval. And to do that, we need a texture 2D array. And a texture 2D array is an actual thing in DirectX. It's not an array of texture 2D objects. It's just called texture 2D array. It's a resource. And then we're gonna add to our sprite vertex, we're gonna add a t, an alpha, to basically uh, store in the vertex itself how far along the animation this specific vertex is, and also alpha for the opacity, which is for the color opacity. If you want, for example, to your explosion to fade in and fade out, for example. Yeah. So this is how basically each resource can hold multiple sub resources, and this is how it would look like. So basically, this has 11 sub resources. Each of these resources has two other uh, scaled down versions for basically long distance viewing. This is basically a map. Yeah, if you want to get the index of said sub-resource, you use calc sub-resource index, and then each sub-resource needs to be initialized with create texture 2D, and that needs a whole lot of descriptions and data. You give it a description, you give it the data, and then you can initialize the texture 2D. And yeah, and you need to give it sub-resource data. But the important part about all of this is that all of this, you don't need to do any of that. This is just for you to know. What you need to do in the assignment is just use create DDS texture from file, which is basically you give it a file that has all the texture index or texture 2Ds that you want, and then that creates a texture 2D array. And for that, we're going to be using a DirectX project that is already in your template, should be, called TextAssemble. And what you want to do is basically add it to the resource generator dependencies. So when you build resource generator, it builds TextAssemble as well, and that you give it basically a bunch of textures, images, and it outputs one singular DDS file to be used. Uh, yeah, the command line is provided in the assignment as always, but you have I'm pretty sure as always you need to change some stuff the to make sure the file paths line up and all that. And also, you need to run TextConv on the DDS after you're done to generate the compressed bitmap at the end of the text assembly. So, how does the texture 2D array work? In the high level shading language and the shader itself, there's just a texture 2D array thing that you can initialize, and you do that by binding it normally the way we do. We access the effect, get variable by name, as shader resource, set resource, and then you put the texture 2D array here. And to sample that array, you just sample it as you would any other texture 2D dot using dot sample, and you give it a filter and then the position, the XY position. Uh, and then yeah, Z in position here is the index of that array. Another way is basically to just initialize it with square brackets, and then you would access it using square brackets, and that would just return you a normal texture to the object that you would sample as you would normally if it were just one texture 2D. And unfortunately, the high level shading language does not support having a dynamic index, so you can't like G sprite vertex square brackets I, and then whatever I is what gets sampled. That doesn't work. You have to have a constant in there. So a good way to do this, well, a way to do this, not specifically good, is just shut up. Is just basically to have a case switch statement that because the amount of textures is non-variable. It's a constant amount. This cannot be changed if you set it. And having a case switch statement will work basically. And yeah, like, uh, basically not the best option. I personally don't know what other options there are, but I'm pretty sure there is a better option than having a case switch statement. Uh, yeah, to render the explosion is just the same process. For the projectile, it's just a sprite. You need a sprite vertex, but what you need to do is that at a steady interval, using the f elapsed time, is to just progress the animation state t, and that goes through and changes the sample texture in the shader so that the animation moves from one keyframe to another every frame or every 2 frames. Depends how fast your explosion you want, how fast you want your explosion to be. And then, of course, sort, render it along with the projectiles. You need to sort it according to depth, which is distance from the camera, so that the blending is adequate. Does anyone have any questions so far about the explosions? Hmm. Okay then. Moving on to particles, which are just more sprites, where you basically just create explosion particles, which are just sprite vertices with a specific non-changing texture that just go out of the explosion in random directions. Uh, for storage, so you have 3 types of particles. You have projectiles. You have, uh, 3 types of sprites. You have projectiles, you have particles, and you have an explosion. You can either put them all in one container and render all of them, or you can just put them in separate containers and then render each separately. There's no one correct way to do that. Depends on how you've structured the other uh, sprites so far, and if you can like change that or make that structure work for the other types of sprites that you have. Initialization, you want a random direction, random speed, maybe size if you want it. Of course, you don't want to have a very large range of size because you don't want the particle to be bigger than the actual explosion. But a way to initialize something in a random direction, of course, you can just initialize for like basically the velocity of the particle. You can just initialize x, y, and z in a random interval between -1 and 1, but that won't be that good. Another way to do this, or an alternative, is to do this and then to discard if the length of the vector is larger than 1. This might take a while because random numbers, and just you keep generating random numbers until you get one that isn't length bigger than 1. A better alternative, in my opinion, is to just basically you generate 2 random angles, and then you use this vector basically to calculate the velocity. So you get two random angles, and then this is the velocity of the particle and the direction it's going, and it just goes. Yeah, it's just a normal sprite. Nothing special about it. It uses, you can use any texture you want for the sprite. Doesn't matter. And yeah, any questions so far? No. Well, so here it says we're not done. Now, so far, this is all of it for the exam material. Anything after this point is not, first of all, is not relevant to the exam and is not required. Uh, this is just going to be me telling you like how could you improve your performance while you're making a graphics engine. This is not relevant to the exam or the assignments. It's just extra knowledge for if in the future, for whatever reason, you decide to make your own graphics engine using DirectX, this is a good way to improve your performance. Uh, Otherwise, if you want to leave, feel free to do